Welcome to Grief Sucks Life After Loss, where we talk all things grief. Thanks for being with us today, and we hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome, Richard. Thanks for being here with us today.
Absolutely. Been looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. So you have a story, just like we all have a story, and can't wait to hear yours.
Yeah. So I think the best place to start, just because later in my life there's a little bit of perspective, but my parents were 15 and 18. So my mother was 15 years old and my father was 18. So they were babies having babies. They had a literal shotgun wedding, and there I was. And that really wasn't. We don't know anything is different about our families until maybe we start seeing cousins, or then for sure school. We get to school and we're like, wait, my house doesn't look like everyone else's. But there was a bit of that where it was like, hey, that guy's dad comes and picks him up sometimes. Like, what? How come only my mom's coming to get me? Or their parents looked old to me. They looked like grandparents to me, and they were really probably younger than I am now. So it's just ironic. Yeah, so I was born to some very young parents. My dad was the quintessential cool guy in high school, played football, dropped out, didn't want to go to class, that kind of thing. 13 aunts and uncles globally, a big Irish Catholic family. So I have a large family, for the better part, close family. But that becomes relevant as well, because sometimes families keep secrets, and sometimes families kind of hold the story close to the heart, so to speak, to some people's detriment. So grew up I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, born and raised here. And despite the fact that I sound like this is a pretty big city. We just all sound like this here. And I grew up in a moderately poor to middle class neighborhood. While we were definitely low income poor, my mother was able to find a way for us to go to Catholic school. And it became one of my saving graces in life, honestly. I got a wonderful education. We had to work cake booths and clean the building after hours, things like that, to help pay for it. But it was definitely a blessing. Again, it wasn't really until I got to grade school and started to see that there were differences in my household. My father was an alcoholic, and pre cell phones, what that looked like if somebody went on an alcohol induced bender, you just had to wait it out. There was no, you call the two or three bars that they might frequent often, call their two or three friends, and either they cover for them or they're with them, and you have to wait for them to return. And as a kid, that didn't really mean much to me, other than I started to pick up on what it did to my mother, the stress that it caused her. She and she would check out mentally a little bit. Those are the things that I remember about that. I was good in school. It was, like I said, a saving grace that my mother was able to help with that, because school was easy for me. And that's where I got a lot of positive affirmations, was, you know, straight A's and do my homework before I changed after school. And I was probably about 5, 6 years old before I started to realize that the drinking that my father did was an issue, because really my entire family, well, I shouldn't say the entire family, but all the social interactions that we had, except for grandma and grandpa's on my dad's side, for holidays, there was drinking involved. My mother's parents lived out in the country in Oldham County, and that's where I spent all my weekends and summers growing up. And again, was another saving grace, because from about 5, 6 years old on, his alcoholism started to cause more and more problems financially. It was hard for my dad to keep a job. He had to take jobs that had a company vehicle because we didn't own a car. Didn't really benefit us if he wasn't around, though. So there was a lot that came along with that, and then started to see the impact it had on my parents' marriage and stress that it caused there, and was kind of trapped in that. As a kid, there wasn't a lot I can do. I can remember, though, making deals with my father at a certain point that I'll keep getting straight A's if you quit drinking, and stuff like that, to just, as a child, you don't really understand. And, trying to barter with someone that has a problem. So I'd love to say that, that's it. And, because that's enough. Alcoholism, drug addiction, it's enough, But the reality was there was something a lot worse going on, and he was just self medicating. So I believe I would have been about 12 years old, 11, 12 years old when my father decided to get sober, or at least made a real effort at it. And during that time frame, he had an uncle that he was very close to that committed suicide. And he asphyxiated himself. He took a garden hose and duct tape and ran it to his cab. He was, gone for several days until the state police found him. And, the impact it had on my dad was significant enough that it caused a psychotic break. And he became paranoid, detached from reality, thought that his best friend had something to do with that death, just based on seeing duct tape in his home, and just started drawing connections that really weren't even there. And at that age, I mean, I'm used to turmoil, I'm used to dysfunction and chaos, but this was something different. I can remember being at the psychiatric hospital. They wouldn't let us visit myself or my younger sister. I have a sister who's 3 years older. And I remember being on an elevator. My sister was crying. My mom had sent us down to the cafeteria, and there was a nurse, or she was in scrubs, let's put it that way. And she said, "What's wrong, little girl?" "Well, we can't see our dad." "Oh, why not? Where's your dad?" "He's on," and I don't know what the wing was, but let's say 4 North. And she was like, "Oh, honey, you don't want to go see him. He's crazy. Your
Was
dad's
she
crazy." This was an employee in a psychiatric hospital telling kids this. And, that was my first introduction to mental health stigmas, I think, at least that I can recognize. And it angered me because it was like, hold on, you don't know my dad. But then also it was kind of like, what does that mean? Like, we can't see him. Are we safe around him? Can we be around him? Because for the most part, he was not necessarily a violent man. But once mental illness was apparent in his life, that changed from time to time. My father's schizophrenic and bipolar. I would guess that today they would probably have diagnosed him schizoaffective. That'd probably been a cleaner diagnosis. And unfortunately, he's like a lot of individuals that struggle with chronic mental illness. The medications that work are the older versions, and they have much greater side effects it's terrible. He was kind of almost catatonic a lot of the time. He would just sit in a chair and no visible emotion, drool at times. So he would stop taking the medicine and lie and say, "Oh, I am taking it." And eventually, we'd be back to square one. He'd be missing. He would make a suicide attempt, or he would relapse and be gone for a few days or a week or whatever it was. But things were very difficult once the mental illness was apparent. And again, that's kind of why I say that alcoholism should be enough, but the mental illness, we started to be mocked and bullied in school by other kids. And, the reality is their parents were a part of these conversations as well. So some of this trickled down from adults, in hindsight, anyways. At that time, I just recognized that I was being picked on. But it was pretty terrible. It was not uncommon for people to talk about our crazy father, this, that, and the other. And it had some long standing effects on us, myself and my sister, but it seemed to grow in intensity. By the time I was 14, I was done. That doesn't sound like a long time, but again, every 4 to 6 months, he would cycle. He would lose touch with reality. There would sometimes be violence in there, hurting our mother, something like that. Started to get in between them to try to prevent that stuff from happening, shield her, my sister. And by the time I was 14, I was tired of being a victim. I was tired of being afraid of people. I was tired of being afraid of being hurt. And I was not a kid that started things. but I had a chip on my shoulder. I looked for an excuse to set somebody straight. Looking back, like obviously I was acting out and having trouble dealing with some things, but what had happened is my father choked me unconscious. And when I came to, I lived in the front of our house, and so the front door was in my room. Once he was clear of the room, I took off and I was like, I'm out of here. I'm gone. I went to his best friend's house, ironically, the man that had the duct tape earlier in this story. But when I got there, because I'm on foot, uh, pre cell phone, pre driving, and the door opens and there sat my father. He
No.
had beat me there. And I can remember him laughing and mocking me, telling me, she's my wife. Who do you think she's going to choose in this situation? And so I took off again and I went to a friend's house. And eventually my mother found me, calling around. And she gave me an ultimatum. She would either turn me over as a ward of the state or I could go to counseling. And at that time, it made me angrier, obviously, but it felt like I was being punished and that she was choosing him, that she was choosing someone that hurt me. Again, it became one of those saving graces in my life in the long run because I saw that therapist off and on from that point until I was 18 years old. And, I was a wild teenager. In hindsight, I was looking for opportunities to show people how fearless I was, things like that. But I was good in school. I never played around with my education. Even if we were out all night, I was at school the next morning, and sometimes it was a running joke. It's like, where did he go? And it's like, he probably went to school. And I loved it. It introduced me to one of the outlets that I still utilize in my life, which is writing. It was something that afforded me an opportunity to have control over what I was doing. Like when I write, I can create whatever world that I want, and I'm in control of that. There was some freedom that provided me. Obviously, it's an outlet as well. It helped me process emotions and thoughts that I was struggling with. Even if I was writing fantasy or fiction, it was still able to exercise through character development and things some of the stuff that I struggled with. That's all I've ever wanted to be was a writer. That's all I've ever wanted to be. I remember at that age, I had a high school teacher. I wrote an essay about wanting to be a writer, and he wrote back, "You already are a writer. It's just something that you'll continue to develop and grow with." I didn't think about that for a long time. I found that essay years later and was like, man, kind of missed it. And I had somebody tell me once, they're like, the difference between an amateur and a professional? I was like, have no idea. One's paid and one's not, but they're doing the same thing. And I was like, that's a good point. Like being a writer doesn't necessarily mean that's a career for you. So that's still professionally what I wanted to do. So through those teenage years, I started college early. I moved out of my parents' home at 14. By 17, I had my own apartment, and I lived with an aunt and uncle prior to that, and the grandparents. Not so much as a teenager, but growing up, they drove an 18-wheeler, and that's how I spent summers. Was all over the highways in the United States, and to date, I do not want to fly. Let's jump in the car. Let's drive. That's the trip. So they provided me safety. They provided me unconditional love in a lot of ways. And that was um that was important later in life because by the time I was 20, I started college while I was in high school. I had about a year and a half done when I started college, and I was smart enough to realize like you can't just be a writer. You have to support yourself. So I was like, well, I'll teach until I build the writing career. And took a bunch of teaching courses, and by the time I got to doing student teaching, they sent me to a middle school here in Louisville. That broke me. These kids were bad. They were off the hook. I was not prepared for that, and I immediately changed my major to English. I was like, can't teach. I mean, I didn't. It was so bad. I didn't even think about high school or elementary. I was like, no,
Yeah.
I can't do this. This is a hard no for me. So I worked on that English degree. And then I added another bachelor in psychology because human behavior was the only other thing that I was really interested in. Ironically, well, not ironically, I mean, I think for people that grow up in a dysfunctional family, you're exposed to a lot of things. And I think that it is kind of like, I want to understand better what's going on here. So, yeah, I added that, and that kind of became my career path, was that psychology degree, honestly. So by the time I was 20, I had a kid on the way, and I didn't have much to do with my dad for many of those teenage years. It was one of those, it was like a, you can't hurt me if I don't let you in. So I'm just not going to let you in. You know, fool me once, fool me twice. No, we're not doing this anymore. And the thing of it was, he actually started to achieve long-term recovery. He relapsed way less. He would put a year or two together at a time, and the relapses were shorter lived. He would take his medication for the most part. The cycling became shorter and shorter, as far as like how often it happened. I should say longer. But by the time I was 20, I've got a kid on the way, and all of a sudden, like my entire life, I was forced to grow up quicker. I thought I knew everything, and it was like, I don't know half of what I think I know about life with this kid on the way. All I know is I don't want to be my father. I want my kid to not have that dad. And I remember going to my parents' home, and when I told them, my dad just had this shit-eating grin on his face. Joy is probably the best way for me to describe that. And my mother started lecturing, and you're going to need to do this, and you're going to have to do that. And when I left that encounter, I remember contemplating just, what was that? What was that happiness? Like, our relationship was very difficult and troubled, and he was just overjoyed. And from that moment forward, my dad was my best friend. We
Wow.
never went backwards. We didn't really discuss the past. We didn't really work through that and move forward. We just moved forward. I dealt with much of that in my own therapy journey and kind of left it there. But we did everything together. I come from a big hunting family, so deer hunting, University of Louisville sports, anything that they had. If they had a paper airplane team, we would have watched it. We'd have bought tickets and went and watched it. But everything, even worked together. And I say that jokingly because he was on disability and he couldn't really keep a job. He hard worker, but if he cycled or was off his meds, he would say or do things that would alarm coworkers, and it caused difficulty in the social settings. He would call me all day long. What are you doing? Working. Okay, well, I'll talk to you later. What are you doing? Well, same thing I was 5 minutes ago, working. You know, he like literally throughout the day we would just talk off and on, and sometimes it was about the game the night before, sometimes it was about whatever, but it was, the irony there is that my dad always knew what to say. He always knew what to say to me when something had me upset or bothered in a way that really no one else ever has, probably even since, to be honest. It's a very humble approach to things. Like, he would use himself in a humble way, like, exercise some humility and be like, I can remember one particular incident. He said, "You got nothing to be ashamed about or nothing to feel bad about. You've accomplished more in 20, I don't remember how old I was at the time, but 20 something years of life than I have in my whole life." And I was like, just that perspective and hearing that from him was like, wow, like, yeah, I'm not going to let this bother me. The calls were also annoying. So my dad was bored. He didn't feel much like a man.
Yeah.
Those long days left him with nothing but his thoughts, and it caused a lot of depression, suicide attempts. He, my mother worked disability money back then. I mean, it was like a $500 check probably, or 450. I mean, what are you going to do with that? That didn't even pay for the cigarette habit that he had, to be honest. So, yeah, it was a wonderful relationship. He's my best friend, and had that kid. I married the the girl that I was with, which public service announcement is the wrong reason to get married. You shouldn't marry someone just because you have a kid together. And we had a second son. So I had two sons. And the second one was born 3 months premature. He weighed 1 pound, 10 ounces when he was born. It's its own story, honestly. It was the most terrifying thing I think I've ever been through. His diapers looked like a pack of cigarettes. I mean, the size of them, it was
Tiny.
terrifying. But he, yeah, for the most part, perfectly healthy 19-year-old kid now. He was definitely a miracle, but it was a trying time. It probably factored into the ending of that marriage in some ways, not to put that on him at all, but it exacerbated the problems we already had. It just kind of really brought him to the surface. I never missed a day going up to the hospital to be with him in the NICU unit. I can remember her not going at times and kind of confronting her about that. And, right now I look at that, even though that's my ex-wife, and I'm like, probably shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't, that was her call, and she was probably trying to take care of herself. But it just,
Mhm.
I'm like, I don't understand how there's this detachment with you as his mom. You carried him. And so it brought a lot of things to a head. And we, in 2006, February 2006, I left our home, started the divorce process basically. And my sons were 4 and 1. It was it was difficult. I went from seeing my kids every day and being there in the evenings, even though I was in graduate school studying clinical psychology. I made sure that I was home for dinner, to give them a bath, put them to bed, that kind of thing before I did homework. And it worked. I was present for the most part. Now, I still missed a lot, I would say, in hindsight, but classes were usually in the evening, things like that. I worked full time. I usually had to work a couple jobs to help us get by. But because not too long after, yeah, because I was at 20. So, yeah, just a year or two later, I was working in the field of corrections and studying clinical psychology, particularly forensic. And it was pretty busy. So you've got graduate school, you've got these young parents that probably shouldn't have been married in the first place. You've got this premature child. I mean, there's a lot of factors that went into that. And just a few months after that, I'm done with my master's degree, and I finished that part of my education, preparing to start on my PsyD, and I'm in the middle of what I can only describe as a brutal divorce, trying to take everything that's mine and give it to her, and basically I had to close on my back. It was a eye-opening experience as to how our legal system works in some ways. It's not like TV. It is not always about what's true and what's false, or what's right and what's wrong. Sometimes it's about how much money you have and your
Yeah.
attorney. Is what I found out. I had an attorney whose pants didn't fit correctly, and she did not. It became evident, and I only stay there and stress on that a minute because this is what my life looked like in this season of dealing with the stress of this divorce, wrapping up part of my education. I ended up getting put on a wait list for acceptance into the PsyD program. And it's like I've been a college student for 8 years of my life. This is part of my identity. Like, you've provided my entire education. Why would you waitlist me? Like, if I'm not ready, then that's a reflection of you. This is what my thought process was. And I'm in that season of my life while, you know, not while, but when everything kind of unfolds. And November 12th of 2006, my father made the decision to shoot and kill himself while hunting. And the short way to describe that is it destroyed me. Probably the first time since I was a child did I feel helpless and out of control. Like I couldn't control my emotions. I think that if I could have cried and sobbed like that, it would have been productive, but it was just tears streaming. I couldn't stop them. I couldn't really formulate thoughts. Eating, sleeping, if I closed my eyes, it just triggered things. So It was a really terrifying experience, and it also really the veil got pulled back. I found out how precious and how fragile life is. You know, this was my best friend. After all these years of turmoil, I finally have the father I've always wanted, and now he's gone. And I was very angry. On top of that, I was very angry at God particularly. And I really wasn't sure what I believed as far as faith goes. I grew up in a Catholic church, and I just never really had a personal relationship with Christ. That's not an attack on Catholicism, but that was my experience. If you asked questions or you tried to wrestle with your faith, you were told, this is what we believe. And it was like, I don't know that I do, though. And you really weren't allowed to wrestle with that. So now with this moment, I've got real questions for you, God. In
Right.
fact, I dared him. I demanded that he reveal himself and fight me, explain this to me. It's kind of like Forrest Gump and Lieutenant Dan up in the crow's nest, drunk in a storm. I mean, I had a lot of those moments where it was like, I want you to explain it. Why would you put me through this? I watched my father try to kill himself over and over growing up, and I can remember having thoughts like, why would you do this to us, God? Why don't you just take him? It's worse to just keep living in fear of that phone call or these moments. And why are you putting us through this? And now that it's happened, it's like I thought one of two things: either you're not real or you don't love me. That was really the only things that I could deduce. And from where I stood at that point in my life, I felt like he absolutely did not answer me, did not reveal himself, and kind of confirmed that either one of those were plausible answers. And I started to live my life as if there was nothing else after life. After this lifetime, it was like none of that's real. I poured myself into that career of mine. I was at this point, I worked my way to the director position of a correctional facility. So I literally have a career where I have the utmost control in that sense. And I only get to see my sons every other weekend. I've got to deal with this ex-wife that we just don't get along. Like, it's always about, where are you taking them? What are you doing? And she's got men spending the night. And it was just like I wasn't allowed to say anything, and she had all the control. And I'm like, this
Mhm.
my life was upside down. And I couldn't cope with that. All the education and training that I had meant nothing when he died. I didn't deal with the trauma of it was the issue. I'd never dealt with a lot of the trauma that I experienced growing up, to be honest. Even in therapy, I never really dealt with the trauma. It provided me an outlet to process the emotions that I was feeling, but it was not trauma informed therapy. It was not any kind of trauma interventions. So, I had PTSD for a while, and even once I feel like I moved through that later, depression has been a part of my life since he died, and I believe always will be, which I'll touch on a little bit. You can only pour yourself into a career so much. At some point, you got to clock out and leave that place. And I had nothing. So I became a serial dater. I chased women, I chased alcohol, whatever I could to not feel and not think about that pain. And when I began that career in corrections, I wanted to be a police officer. Went through the hiring process here in Louisville. At the time, we had two police departments. And when I was training, I was taking androstenedione, which was the same over the counter steroids Mark McGuire was taking, that they outlawed at a certain point. So I put on way too much muscle too fast, and I ended up herniating two of my discs. Basically, got encouraged, like, hey, you should go work in corrections. They'll take anybody, is kind of what they said. I was like, that's reassuring. And they won't just take anybody, but yeah. So I bring that up because at that age, I went and saw a surgeon, and they said, you're too young to have this surgery. It's a rather old and crude option. It's going to trade one kind of pain for another. So I'm going to send you to pain management. He encouraged me to wait it out, that medicine was growing, at this accelerated rate. They were already experimenting with laser surgeries. And he's like, the longer you can hold on, maybe you can have a less invasive surgery to fix this. So they sent me to pain management and put me on pain pills, 21 years old. And I took them exactly as prescribed for 6, 7 years. Not even a thought of, hey, I'll take some extra or whatever. And I remember the first time I took more than prescribed, though. It was a U of L U of K game, which is the in state rivalry here. I was at my uncle's house, who's the only U of K fan in the family. We're convinced he's the mailman's kid, but that's another story. Um, I was painfully aware my dad wasn't there. It was the first game after his death. It was just like I was not having fun. I did not feel good. I had brought clothes with me. Wasn't planning on driving, drinking, and I had my medication with me. And I can see myself walk in the room, open the bag, and just took an extra one. And I felt something. I felt good. I felt happy. Pain medication, when taken in excess, causes euphoria. And it was something that was missing in my life. It's not to justify it, but I've had plenty of time since that moment to really process, like, how did I get to where this led me? And my story is no different than anyone else's, whether it's alcoholism or drugs. One's too many and a thousand's never enough, is what they say in 12-step circles. And it was surprising how quickly that became my life. And probably not as quick as other people. I've been through a lot in my life, so I'm pretty high functioning when it comes to chaos and drama. It took a few years for this to really catch up to me and cause problems, noticeable problems. And the whole time I've got this important job that really deserves a lot of attention. And between that and the pain medication and all this, I think I felt fulfilled. I don't know. I know that I felt empty a lot of the times. I've since heard it said, I had a hole in my heart the shape of my dad, and nothing was ever going to fill that. So, in a lot of ways, I was just trying to put any kind of a temporary fix there I could to get through. And eventually, you don't have enough pills, or you can't find any, and someone has a different type of pill, and you take that and it's stronger. And it's like, hey, I really like that one. And then I was introduced to OxyContin, not to be confused with oxycodone. Like, people, hey, my aunt's on OxyContin. No, she's not. She's on oxycodone. But it was derived from oxycodone. It was just, in my opinion, it was synthetic heroin, is what it was. It was just created in a lab. And from the first time that I took it, it was over. It was absolutely over. All control, all ability to hide the addiction, it was gone. It was $1 a milligram, and it was 80 milligram pills. Like, it was $80 for one pill.
Good.
Before it was over, I mean, I had to have 3 to 5 a day just to function, and it was, my entire income was wasted on that, and that wasn't enough. And then I started using my company credit cards to buy cigarettes and sell them. I started, you know, stealing from my employer, basically, and turning in bogus receipts that I made on the printer to try to cover it up. The absolute opposite of what my career and my position stood for. And, since in my healing journey, I've heard it said many a times, like, in addiction, you become something you're not. You become something totally different. And I think that time in my life showed me that there's a monster inside of me. Maybe arguably all of us. And what you feed that monster, or the attention you give it, will determine your life and outcome. But it didn't take too long for that to really catch up to me. I was unable to go to work most of the time. I wouldn't even call them. If they called me, "Where are you?" I would lie, say I was at a university setting up practicum students or something. And eventually I was terminated for that. I'd love to say that being charged for those for that theft was the end of this for me. But, I got pulled over. I had a bunch of pills on me. I tried to talk my way out of it. It made it worse. Like, it piled up in a 3-month period in a way that was insane. I went from having the keys to the jail to being at the jail. And it was like, what is going on with me? What is going on in my life? How did I end up here? It's also when recovery entered my life. Being arraigned in the court system did something that really got my attention. It was shame. And unfortunately, that's my primary disposition as far as negative feelings go, is shame. I think that was maybe my role in my family growing up, was to carry stuff that wasn't mine, and felt shame for it. It was I don't know if this will translate, but it was the greatest thing that could ever happen to me, to be honest. My life was empty. It was a facade. What I cared about were degrees and awards and plaques. There was no substance. And that's kind of goes back to childhood with getting those grades and stuff, and that really being the biggest attaboy that I got hardwired for achievement. And even to date, I have to center myself when I achieve something, because I'm already focused on the next goal. I'm already moving towards the next thing, and none of that's ever going to complete me. So, you know, I spent 2 years of my life, about 19, fighting the cases. There were things that weren't true. They enhanced charges. And I again found out that the criminal justice system doesn't work the way it does on TV. I had so many pills on me that they charged me with trafficking, even though I wasn't selling. They followed me from where I bought them from. And I was like, you can't do that. And they were like, what are you, a lawyer now? But there was a few examples of that. And that's not to deny responsibility for what I did. I absolutely had the drugs. I absolutely was doing wrong. But it was like, that's not true. How can you do that? And that's another conversation. But so for 19 months, I fought these issues. I had an ankle monitor. I wasn't allowed to leave. Couldn't work. Couldn't see my children. And yeah, it did something to my mental health for sure. Eventually, they realized they had some problems in the case, and they wanted to wheel and deal a little bit. And about a month from trial date, they started offering me better options. And eventually, what they offered me was a few amended charges. And hey, look, we'll offer you 5 years, but we're not going to object to probation. You've never been in trouble. You seem like you had a good head on your shoulders. It's kind of obvious what happened in your life. We won't fight to incarcerate you. Well, with the jail credit, I was parole eligible. So even if I did get sentenced, I was probably coming right back out on parole. So I decided that that was a worthwhile. I mean, I was guilty of a lot of things, so I had to take that deal, I thought. And when I went to final sentencing, it said zero jail credit. This is not right. This isn't what we agreed to. It's too late. Like, there's nothing you can do about it. It's signed. The judge, he doesn't come in and make his mind up. His mind had already been made up. And
Right.
I knew. I think I knew for the 6 weeks leading up that I was going to go to prison. I think I just knew in my heart that they were going to make an example out of me. And that's what happened. He remanded me to the state of Kentucky, Department of Corrections, a place I once worked. And like, it's very surreal to have to enter that system. And it was devastating. I was in shock, but it was terrifying too. Like, I'm not gonna tell that story of like, oh, I became this tough guy in there. Like, it was, my safety was a concern. You don't want to work in that field and then get sentenced. So the thing I worried about the most was running into someone that I had worked with over the years, or that had been in one of my facilities. And thankfully, that only happened once, and he didn't remember me. They sent me 6.5 hours from my hometown. I didn't know you could drive that far in Kentucky and still be in Kentucky. In the back of a dog catcher van is basically what it, or it, wow. When I was taken to the jail from the courthouse. They put me in this dorm where I'm going to await transport. And there's men that have been in there 6 months, and they're like, yeah, you need to get comfortable. There's overcrowding everywhere, so you're going to be here a while. I was there 1 week. And I think that that is a testament to what I experienced, to be honest with you, because like I said, there were men that had been there 5, 6 months. But while I was there in my downtown jail, my mother had started trying to minister to me. She was like, you need to get your Bible, you need to start praying. And I'm like, I don't want to hear that, Mom. I don't want to hear it. There ain't nobody out there listening. There's nobody. God's not real. He gave up on me, or he's not real. I don't know how to pray. I remember telling her I don't know how to pray. I know a bunch of prayers they made me memorize, but it's like song lyrics. They don't mean anything to me, I don't think. I remember I was laying in my bed talking to another guy, telling jokes, goofing off something, and they come through and hollered church. And he got up to walk out, and I was like, "Where are you going?" He goes, "Church." I'm like, "For what?" He said, "Well, we ain't got anything better to do." That's a good point. That's why I went. I have no awesome reason. I had nothing better to do, and that was the only way out of that cell for a little bit. And I remember honestly while we were there in this kind of a community room or something where there was one officer and like 20 guys, and then this volunteer that came in. And the whole time I'm thinking how unsafe this is. I'm like, there's only one guy. This is insane. Like, where's all the help? If something happens, what am I going to do? And all of a sudden, he's preaching out of Matthew 6, and he says, "This is how you pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." And I grew up in a Catholic school. I don't know how many times I've read the Bible at this point, but I don't think I ever recognized that the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer, came from Scripture. Kind of ironic she's telling me to do this, but the light bulb still hadn't came on. They transfer me. I get to this place, and I started going to the NA meeting. And the man that came in and did those was a pastor from the tri-state area of Tennessee, Illinois, and Kentucky. I think he was in Tennessee. He comes in and he's like, "Hey, you should come to church. You seem to know a lot about this recovery stuff." And I was like, "Yeah, what do you used to do for a living?" I don't want to talk about that, but he keeps telling me to come to church. And I don't know how many weeks went by, but I eventually went. And what had preceded that was I had come to the conclusion, I had come to the realization that this was all my fault. I can remember sitting on a concrete floor on the phone with my mother, and I'm like, I did every bit of this. Because leading up to it, it was these crooked detectives that added charges. It was my ex-wife. It was my dad's fault. It was my roommate's fault. It was everybody's fault but my own. And sitting there all alone, all I could think about was how badly I had messed up my life and how much that's going to impact my kid. I may never see them again. Maybe even after they're grown men, they might not want anything to do with me. Like, how did I get here? And I remember my mother saying, "You're going to have to forgive yourself." And I told her, "I don't know how you could ever forgive yourself for messing up this bad." Well, I go to church, and he was preaching out of Matthew 7 about forgiveness and taking the plank out of your eye and so on and so forth. And I was like, I don't know what's going on, but two different places, weeks apart. I thought I was on maybe a TV show. I mean, that made more sense to me than God was intervening in my life, because they were actually filming a reality show in the downtown jail at that time. So I thought, I'm on some kind of social experiment show. But the truth is, I encouraged a living God, or I encountered a living God. Like, he met me where I was at, and it went from there. I continued to press into my Bible. I continued to process the mistakes that I had made and just the impact it had on my kids, probably, how to move forward in my life. And it was made even more complicated because my grandfather needed a surgery. And it was kind of the last ditch effort. It involved a valve in his heart. And I think he'd already had a replacement. And I'm in prison. This guy's always been there for me, and I'm not there. And he's probably going to die, and I'm not going to be able to go to the funeral, and everyone knows why. And like, that shame, I was carrying the shame already, and it hadn't even happened. And he was having surgery on a Wednesday, and I'd been going to church, but I wouldn't stand up and get saved. I was embarrassed. I was I didn't want to look like a punk or whatever somebody might call it. I would see guys do it and then go back to the dorm and do whatever and behave no different than they did. And I was like, that's one thing I remember from my earlier experience in church was hypocrisy. And like, there was always a joke, we can do whatever we want, just say we're sorry later as a Catholic.
Yeah.
That's kind of how it works. I'm like, I don't think it works that way, guys. But I didn't want to be a hypocrite anymore. I didn't want to like say one thing and do another. I'd had my fill of that. Church was on Saturdays, and I was tired. And I've been carrying the weight of the world my whole life by myself, and I just couldn't do it anymore. And that Saturday, I stood up and accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior. And on Tuesday, they came and released me unexpectedly. I had a 5-year sentence starting from day one, and I was, what's going on? My judge had granted me shock probation after I was there 90 days. I could probably write a book about those 90 days and make it seem like I did 5 to 10 years there because in my mind that's the weight of being there like this. I found out I'm not cut out for this. I'm not built this way. There's no honor in this. There's nothing to brag about. Like a lot of the things that I thought I knew about it, even working in the system, I found out that's not really what takes place in there, good and bad. I drove all. My uncle came and got me. We drove all night, and I was there for that surgery Wednesday morning.
Wow.
He made it through that surgery. Actually, lived a few more months that I got with him. He passed that October, and this would have been in July of 2012. So I come out. I've got to work. I've got all this restitution and all these things over my head, and so I just start working. Well, while I was there, I made one promise. I'll go to church one time. That's all you get, God. And I drove past that church I grew up in every single day. And sometimes I would, I'd look over and think I promised him I'd go. But the reality was I knew what was in there, nothing for me, anyways. And it was going to absolve me of that promise. I met my wife. We went on what we like to call a not date. I don't go on dates. We can have dinner, but I don't do date. Yeah, I don't date either. And we sat at a Chili's and we told each other every rotten thing we'd ever done or mistakes. We tried, I don't know if we were trying to run each other off or what we were doing, but it was the most refreshing thing I can ever recall. Like it was just different and it was honest and raw. And it was like, so we got married 1 year to the day after that first date.
Wow.
It was like, if I'm being honest, it was a God thing. My faith is in Jesus, but she anchored that faith because she went to church every Sunday. No one reminded her, no one called her. And I worked. So I would always be invited, and I always say, can't, got to go to work. And my card broke down one weekend, and I remember sitting there, I made a bunch of jokes on the way, and it was in an old Catholic church. This is a Baptist church, and I get there, and they're wearing blue jeans, and I'm like, what's going on in it? What are they doing? They got on a lot of flannel in this place, and making jokes, cracking up. And then, I don't know what he was preaching on, but this pastor, in the middle of his sermon, started talking about struggling with his faith. And I was like, he can't say that. He's a pastor. And he followed it up with it. I know what you're thinking. I can't say that because I'm a pastor. And I'm like, what is going on? And, for her, she's having a great Sunday.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm having an encounter with the Holy Spirit. I'm like, this is the first time I've ever heard someone be honest in a church
Mm-hmm.
and be honest that they're not perfect and they don't have it all figured out and that it's okay. And even to struggle with your faith, like it changed everything. It solidified everything I'd experienced. Like this was all real because life has a way of distracting us from important stuff sometimes. And it really solidified all of that. And what I can tell you is that woman saw things in me and spoke things into me that no one's ever seen, that I'd given up on. I was a mess. I had to work for Jimmy John's. I had to sell cars. I had to sell furniture. Jobs that made me want to just curl up and die, honestly, just fed the depression. Because I knew I was better than that. I knew I had more to offer, but my record said otherwise, and you can legally discriminate. And I just, I would get sick of doing these things, and I would try really hard for a month to find another job, and I would just get rejection after rejection, and I'd give up. And in 2016, I was sitting at a car lot I was running, and this guy, his best friend, had shot himself, and he was clinging to life. And all day he's down there at the hospital, and I'm thinking, I know what that's like. I know what that's like. I don't have any. And I went back and forth all day. I don't do dead bodies, and I don't do hospitals, and I don't do death. I can't. And something just kept compelling me to go there, just to be with him. When I got off, I did. And nothing bad happened. I didn't have any flashbacks. I didn't have any triggered emotional responses or flooding. And it started from there. I started as a volunteer, seeing people on Facebook and social media sharing their pain and problems. I started going to the hospital and praying with them, or just sitting with them, sitting with their loved ones so they could go eat because they hadn't ate all day, things like that. And something very foreign from me and myself in
It's
2019.
a
Yeah,
blessing to other people.
it was something I understood, suffering. It was something that made sense to me, that life sucks sometimes. It just does. And we don't have to sugarcoat it. We don't have to lie about it. We don't have to dress it up and pretend. It just sucks. And tomorrow might be better. Eventually, it will be better. It won't be the same, but it will be better than it is right now. And sometimes that's all you can cling to. I kept doing this, and there's a larger component to it, but for time's sake, we'll push through that. But in 2019, I started being asked to do funerals. And I'd said yes before I realized, like, I don't know anything about that. Like, what am I going to do here? And I, for 2 years, I had a pastor of mine who met with me weekly, did eldership training, and just helped me explore this calling God was putting on me, because it made no sense to me. I thought I was crazy half the time. And he said, they don't teach you that in school anyways. And he sent me some templates, and I like to write. So I wrote a service, and there was family drama, and I get that. And I'm no longer bothered by the death in the room or the reality of that. And all these things about me, the psychology and the writing and this calling from God, all comes together to do this funeral for this family, and carry that for them. And I remember when I left and called him, he was like, how do you feel? And I was like, well, I think I need to get sick, nerves. But it was awesome. And I know it's a weird thing to say about a funeral, but I don't know any other way to describe it. It was, for the first time in my life, I know I did something for someone else that they can't repay me for.
Mhm.
It was true service. It was doing something. I spent a great deal of time being selfish, and in active addiction, that's what you become, as a selfish individual. You put your sickness or your desires above everyone else. And to be able to provide something or carry something for a family, not something I can fix, not something I can take off of them, but just, I've been there and I've survived this, and I'm going to help you carry it. I did two last week. I think at this point, I mean, it's over 100. I don't know how many services I've done, but it doesn't really matter. Mostly suicides and overdoses, people that don't have a pastor or church, they don't have life insurance. Families are scrambling to try to figure this out. And it's just something I could take off their plate for them and help carry. And I love it. If I could do it all day long, that's what I would do. God had different plans. I was able to get back into my counseling career, and I was able to get licensed again. I mean, I remember I was like, are you sure that the state is going to allow? I mean, I wrote them a letter. I was like, I want to know before I start this process. Somehow there was a way made. And I'm a licensed clinical alcohol and drug counselor. I worked in MAT, which is medication assisted treatment, for a couple of years, I guess. I also worked with an agency here in town called First Hour Grief Response. And in a nutshell, these women lost kids. They had one lost a husband, and they found there wasn't anything out there for them other than traditional counseling. There was just nothing, and they started this ministry. My wife heard their commercial and was, I'm out here doing all these funerals, and she's like, hey, these place like stole your idea and made a company. And I'm like, what? So I go listen to the commercial, and I'm like, I emailed them that night at 10 o'clock. They emailed me right back, let's meet. brought me in right away, and they're family. I don't worked with them like as a contractor for a couple of years, and they allow me to use office space, still kind of trade services or whatever. But I opened a private practice doing grief counseling for parents that have lost a kid to an overdose. They're kind of the forgotten people in that equation, because once the funeral's over, everyone goes back home, and all the support goes away, and within a week, people find themselves alone. Even in the midst of family, they're alone and isolated. And we talked a little bit before you hit record, but especially in a marriage, if they've lost a kid, the divorce rate goes up. And I think that a large part of it is because they can't cope like they normally would. They
Mhm.
would lean on that person, but see, you're going through it too, so I don't want to lean on you. What if you're having a good day? I don't want to make you cry, and vice versa. And you grow apart because of that pain and stuff, is what I believe to happen in a lot of these cases. And um, I think that happens with grief in general. And
With
death is,
everybody
yeah,
involved, I think, not just
yeah,
partners, friends that don't they either are going through it and don't want to lean on you, or they just don't know what to say. I think it's just a variety of different things. And like you said, once that funeral's over, everybody else's life goes on.
that's
But
right.
you still feel like you're at a dead stop. Like you're just
That's right.
sitting there waiting, and everybody else just keeps moving, just like it was before.
Yeah. I mean, there's people that come to the funeral home on their lunch break.
Hmm.
Yeah, they go back to work from that
Yeah.
funeral home. Your life's changed forever. And there's nothing wrong with that person. That's great.
Yeah,
They were
that's
able
part
to
of it.
par for course with what we're talking about. And I just believe that that is the people that God's called me to walk with. I somehow was able to restore my career in corrections. Been over a decade since these mistakes in my life, and I'm the assistant director of programming in a community corrections center, a substance abuse program, 328 bed male facility of inmates and parolees, and they can't tell me I don't know what they're talking about. They can't tell me that I don't know what it's like, because I've lived it. I've been there. And in some ways, I can be, if they are open and not resistant to the process, I can be a source of hope that, like, man, it can get so much better. It's not going to for a while. It's probably not. I mean, that's the reality. And I think that's the truth with grief as well, because grief's a much larger conversation than just death. But it, I used to say, I don't know why I'm still alive. I don't say that anymore, because I know why I'm still alive. God pulled me out a little bit early, before heroin hit the streets, before fentanyl hit the streets. And he called me into ministry to not just care for people, but to show me that I had worth still, and that he had use and purpose for me. And that all these rotten things I've been through are actually what he's going to use to help other people. So really the only thing that I could encourage anybody, man, is like, if that's where you find yourself, hold on. Hold on. Lean on your people, lean on the people around you, because it does get better. It'll probably get worse before it gets better. And you're going to have great days, and then the next day is devastating again. But that's the process. There is no time frame on grief. Some pain's forever. No one gets to tell you that time heals all wounds. That's a misnomer. Like, people want to hurry you along in your grief. You grieve as long as you need to, as long as you're not hurting yourself or hurting other people. You feel how you feel. And I think we live in a society that collectively we're uncomfortable with people feeling, even ourselves. So, one of the best things you can do for someone grieving is give them permission to sit in their own skin. You feel how you need to. You fall apart if you need to. That's how you have to go through it to get through it. And that's really the easy answer there. Is it's like, you can't avoid this. You can't outrun it. You can't numb it long enough. It's coming out at some point.
And if you avoid it, it's coming back, and it's going to come back worse. And you really do. I think it's very important to sit with it and go through it. because I think a lot of people don't. I think a lot of people just keep going, and eventually that all builds up. It's still there. It's not going anywhere. You didn't process it. You didn't deal with it, and when it comes back, it's going to hit hard.
I use this analogy because most people have seen those boogie boards, the little styrofoam wakeboards. So if anyone's ever tried to stand on one of them in a swimming pool, they weigh like 3 ounces or something. You can't hardly pin it to the bottom of the pool. It's just buoyant. And if you're holding one of them under the water, you can, but you have to really put some weight into it, some strength. And you get to messing around in the pool and talking. And when you get distracted, you loosen just a little bit of that grip. What happens? That thing comes flying out of the water, hits you in the chin, flies out of the pool, hits a kid. Like, that's what happens when we try to bury our grief. It's going to come out, and it's probably coming out sideways. And we're going to hurt people that we love and care about because we were trying to avoid something. And, that's not an indictment. Everyone's just doing the best they can when they're grieving. But I think that's part of it too, is the more that we normalize talking about things like this, the more that people can have permission to feel the way they need to feel in their skin and be able to heal to whatever degree possible. While you're never going to get over losing your child or losing your spouse or whatever this is, there there is a healing ahead. I look at it like this. I think what I struggle with at this stage is that I've accomplished so many things in the last couple of years. What I wouldn't give for one of those annoying phone calls with my dad, and I can't. And it's been hard to enjoy and appreciate some of that because I was distracted by that loss. And I realized I'm still alive. I'm going to waste my life if I bury myself with him. And it doesn't mean I don't need to spend time thinking about him and talking to him and loving him. That's not going to change. But I also, they call it a gift, like the gift of life. Like this is my life. I get one chance at this. And when I started to believe that, and when I started to put that forth in my life, and things started to manifest, when I realized, like, I'm here for a reason, and why not me? Why can't this be my story? Who says I can't come back from these things? The shame wants to tell me that I'm not good enough, I'm dirty, I've messed up, people will judge me. I figured it out a long time ago. People are going to judge you no matter what you do.
Right.
So, and here's the thing, I'm not running for office, so your vote doesn't count. It just, it is what it is. But I got custody of those two boys in the long run. I have three other children, and like, I really got a do over in life. And I'm trying to use my story to help encourage people to hang on and to have a little hope. Everyone's just at a different stage of this journey, is really all that we're talking about. There are days that you'll go backwards a little bit, and there are days you're going to move forward exponentially. But the thing is to keep pushing forward, sit down when you need to, breathe, and take care of yourself. Self care is not selfish, especially if you have kids. That can be hard, but like, you have to find something for you. You have to find some way to decompress and get away from life in a healthy way, rather
Mhm.
than through chemicals or something like that. But I don't think everyone goes through the extremes that I have, and some people have been through worse. But I believe that if my life can turn around and positive things can be in store for my life, then it gives me hope for everyone else that, like, nobody really gets to limit us other than us in some ways. And, granted, there are, you know, I'm never going to be a police officer. Like, that's out of the question. Sure, there's like some specific things in life that we'll be out of, but the limit is us. And we should start believing we deserve nice things again. We should start believing that and it might be new relationships. It might just be getting back to our passions and goals, things that we gave up on. I mean, that's part of what this journey's been for me as I healed, was to start writing again and using that writing and sharing my story to help encourage other people. So, as and I kind of mentioned this when we talked originally, is that's really where I'm shifting my career, my life is I want to build a speaking career and a writing career where I can share my story and use it for some good and provide me a lifestyle that is more conducive to be with my family as much as possible because kids won't be kids forever, and
Nope,
you
they grow
know
quick.
they go very quick. And I'd love to have an RV and we just travel and do speaking gigs and have adventure. But regardless of what happens, all of it's been afforded. And it was, I had to do a lot of intentional stuff, but therapy, my faith has a great deal to do with it. But the biggest thing was I had to find community. I had to find safe places to share my shame, safe places to share my pain and burden. And that's kind of my saying is that you got to lean on your people. If you don't have people, we need to find you some. Like there's a community out there for you, and that's another thing that I've found working as a mental health clinician. There's resources all over. We just don't know about them. Even people in the fields are so disconnected from what's out there. We don't realize that there's organizations like First Hour Grief Response or such and such. So it's like, wow, we we need to talk more. We need to end these stigmas, and we need to normalize uncomfortable conversations, not because it's fun, but because we all go through it. And, you know, so I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to share my story.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing your story, and thanks for using what you went through to help other people. It's very important. And like I said, I mean, there's a lot of people that don't have people. So, sharing and doing what you do to help those people who maybe don't have somebody that they can relate to is a huge blessing for them. Because a lot of people just don't have those people that understand.
Yeah, as I wrote a book. I basically wrote my story, and as I shopped publisher and stuff, and I didn't find any success as of yet. But I got a lot of valuable feedback. One of the things that I was told, like, I guess you got to be able to help sell books these days. And that was one of the things I was told is like, you need to grow a platform to help with this. And I was like, what does that look like? So I started using social media in that way. I don't always have a story to write. I don't always have this big elaborate essay to give to the world. Sometimes it's just a meme that really spoke to me or a song or something. And that's legitimate. I'm thinking about how many times I was just clinging, sitting in my car praying for something to happen, and then a song came on, or someone shared a meme, and it was like, man, that's life right there.
Mhm.
That is life. Some days that's as good as it gets, and we can go to sleep that night and try again tomorrow. And so that's what I'm out there trying to do.
Some days it's the little things that get us through.
That's right.
All right, Richard. Well, I appreciate you being here. And is there, well, once you get your book published, share it with me and then I'll put it on my platforms.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed our conversation today. If you would like to join us on Facebook, you can find us at Grief Sucks Life After Loss. We look forward to seeing you again.